Creepy Dave. When I was a teenager, I worked at a small local bakery with fewer than 15 employees covering day and night shifts. During the day, there were just a few of us, including Dave, the delivery driver. From the start, Dave gave me an unsettling feeling. He was in his mid-50s, overly friendly, and far too interested in me, a teenage girl. Despite my discomfort, the boss assured me that Dave was annoying but hardworking, advising me to ignore his behavior. Looking back, I should have recognized the lack of a background check as a red flag. Over the year I worked there, I tried to avoid Dave. His behavior was rarely overtly inappropriate, but always off-putting. He lingered after his shift, stood too close, and constantly asked about my personal life, from my hobbies to whether I had a boyfriend. He frequently commented that someone like me should have a boyfriend. When he found out my favorite music, he started offering tickets to concerts I wanted to attend, always with the condition that I go with him. On my birthday, he brought me a t-shirt that was far too small and insisted I try it on and send him a photo. He gave me his phone number and asked for mine, but I refused. He even tried to get my number from a coworker who thankfully had my back. The unwanted gifts and offers escalated, including VIP tickets to a concert restricted to those over 21. He said he could sneak me in if I went with him alone. I declined every time, unwilling to trust him. I mentioned Dave's behavior to my boss, but they brushed it off as classic Dave. He once hugged me on his birthday without my consent, and when I complained, the reaction was the same: dismissive excuses for his lack of boundaries. One day, Dave's name vanished from the schedule. My boss called me into the office to inform me that Dave had been fired. They had discovered he was a convicted sex offender with charges including rape and kidnapping a minor from decades earlier. He had lied on his paperwork and failed to report his status or address changes. When the bakery contacted the police, they uncovered additional charges involving stalking and harassment. After his termination, Dave returned to the bakery with a weapon. Thankfully, I wasn't there that day. The situation ended with him leaving in handcuffs. I later learned that his abdominal scar wasn't from a snowboarding accident, as he had claimed, but from an injury sustained while running from the police years earlier. Even now, I think about how dangerous the situation could have become if I had accepted one of his concert invitations. To Dave, I hope I never see your face again. The office routine. This story took place about 10 years ago, so some details might be a little fuzzy, but I'll try to recount it as accurately as I can. At the time, I was 22, working as a receptionist at a marketing office while putting myself through college. It seemed like a good job, and my first day left a strong impression on me. Everyone was so welcoming and kind, stopping by to introduce themselves. I felt like I would fit right in. As the months passed, I made a few friends in the office, though most of them were older. While it was sometimes hard to relate to conversations about kids and grandkids, I enjoyed my workplace overall. I became acquainted with almost everyone. Almost. One person stood out, a man named Lucas. Lucas was unique. He followed a rigid routine every day. He arrived at the same time, walked the same path to his desk, and meticulously arranged his workspace in the same way. He'd tap his phone a set number of times before picking it up, and would interact only with a few specific coworkers. Curious, I asked my friend Alex about Lucas, and he explained that Lucas had a severe form of OCD. When Lucas had started working there, he disclosed his condition to management, who shared it with the team to ensure everyone would be patient and understanding. Over time, many of the people Lucas trusted left or were promoted, leaving him with only 3 coworkers he felt comfortable speaking with. Management accommodated him by allowing his limited interactions, as long as his work was completed. Once I learned this, I felt bad about my initial assumption that Lucas was simply unfriendly. I adjusted my perspective and tried to respect his boundaries, along with the rest of the team. Everything seemed to work smoothly for a while. One day, our boss had a client visit the office, a loud, intrusive man named Mike. I had met Mike once before and found him overbearing and disrespectful. He burst into the office, shouting for the boss and ignoring my polite request to sign in. Mike's boisterous behavior quickly made the entire office uncomfortable as he moved from desk to desk, making unnecessary comments. When I saw Mike heading toward Lucas's desk, I started to worry. Lucas kept to himself, and any disruption to his routine could be upsetting. Mike plopped himself on the edge of Lucas's desk, ruffled his hair, and said, "Having a good day, buddy?" Lucas's face turned bright red as he silently endured the intrusion. Then Mike began rifling through papers on Lucas's desk and playing with his carefully arranged pens. Several coworkers intervened, asking Mike to stop, but he only laughed and said, "If he has a problem, he can tell me himself." It was clear Lucas had reached his limit. He stood up, yelled in Mike's face, and shoved him off the desk. Mike hit the ground, and Lucas began kicking him repeatedly with a ferocity none of us had ever seen. He landed several hard blows to Mike's side and head before another coworker tried to intervene. Unfortunately, touching Lucas to pull him away only made things worse. Lucas turned and started swinging punches at the person restraining him. Amid the chaos, someone called the police. When they arrived, Lucas was still enraged, and Mike was curled on the floor, barely moving. The paramedics were called, and Mike was taken to the hospital with a severe concussion, broken ribs, and a punctured lung. Lucas was arrested for assault. Mike pressed charges, but the case didn't go far after footage and context about Lucas's mental health were presented in court. Still, Lucas lost his job. While we all understood why it had to happen, it felt unfair that Mike's provocation had forced Lucas into such a situation. After the dust settled, Lucas kept in touch with the few coworkers he trusted, and I was relieved to hear he found another job that supported his need for a structured routine. He deserved a workplace where he could thrive without interference. The grocery stalker. When I was 15, I landed my first job at a grocery store. I was excited to learn and adapt to the responsibilities, from organizing groceries to cleaning around the store. The first few weeks went well, but there was one glaring problem. A coworker I'll call Creepy Chris. Chris was about 20 years old, thin, and completely oblivious to the concept of personal space. As a short and inexperienced teenager, I had never dealt with unwanted male attention before, but Chris made his presence impossible to ignore. He often hovered too close behind me while I bagged groceries, drawing reprimands from the assistant manager for neglecting his duties. Outside the store, he would time his breaks to walk out with me, making awkward small talk as I returned carts. While he never touched me, his constant closeness was unnerving. I was hesitant to escalate the issue, unsure if it warranted a complaint, and I didn't want to jeopardize my first job. I tried asking Chris to step back a few times, but my requests were timid and largely ignored. Things took a dark turn one day when I was asked to clean the bathrooms. While waiting for the mop bucket to fill in the back room, Chris appeared and began talking to me. Gradually, he stepped closer and closer until I was cornered by the mop sink. My exit blocked. Panicked, I blurted out, "Chris, can you please move? I need to clean the bathrooms." He ignored my request, stepping even closer until our shoes were touching. Then he leaned in and asked, "And what if I don't move?" Adrenaline took over. I grabbed the broom and swung it with all my strength, hitting him on the head and breaking it in the process. He fell to the floor stunned. I jumped over him and ran to the women's bathroom, locking the door behind me. Moments later, he banged on the door, yelling that it was just a joke. I sat in the bathroom, shaking and crying, unsure of what to do. The banging suddenly stopped, replaced by the sound of a key in the lock. Terrified, I prepared for the worst, only to find my female manager on the other side. A shopper had apparently reported Chris's behavior, and management sent him home, dismissing the incident as a misunderstanding. I quit the next day after speaking with my parents. It was a terrifying and formative experience that taught me to trust my instincts. The office bully. At the time of this story, I was in my early 30s and working in a moderately busy office environment. My job wasn't anything special, just a standard, monotonous desk job that was far from the dreams I had envisioned for myself growing up. Like many, I'd been told that pursuing a college degree was the key to landing a well-paying, fulfilling career. But after graduating with an overwhelming amount of debt and no opportunities in my chosen field, I settled into something unremarkable, and I resented every bit of it. The frustration and bitterness I felt about my situation were constant. My work consisted of endless paperwork and phone calls, and the daily grind left me feeling not only bored but deeply unhappy. Some people might thrive in such roles, but I wasn't one of them, and my discontent was obvious. My boss once admitted that if I weren't so good at my job, my attitude alone would have been enough to let me go. But frankly, I didn't care. If I were fired, I figured I'd just end up somewhere else, doing something equally soul-sucking. Looking back, I see now how much my unhappiness bled into my interactions with others. I was known around the office as the difficult one, the person with a chip on their shoulder who never bothered to hide it. My coworkers generally avoided me, and being an introvert, I didn't mind. In fact, I preferred it that way. But what I didn't realize then was just how rude and inconsiderate I had become. I wasn't just standoffish. I was outright mean. I mocked people openly, often making cruel remarks about their appearances, habits, or struggles at work. I didn't even try to hide my disdain. At the time, I brushed off the consequences, even when people confronted me about hurting their feelings. I laughed it off, dismissing their concerns as overreactions. Visits to HR became a regular occurrence, but I was never disciplined beyond warnings, probably because my performance numbers were decent. Then came the day that changed everything. During lunch in the break room, one of my coworkers, let's call her Lisa, walked in. Lisa was a larger woman, and when she went to heat up her leftover pizza, I made a cruel comment about whether she really needed to eat that. The room went silent, and I'll never forget the look on her face. Tears welled up in her eyes before she ran out of the room. The others stared at me, their expressions filled with anger and disgust. I left the room, feeling a flicker of shame for the first time. That incident stuck with me. For the first time, I began to see myself for who I was, a bully. The realization hit hard. I wanted to apologize to Lisa, but when I saw her surrounded by others trying to comfort her, I couldn't bring myself to approach her. She hadn't done anything to deserve my cruelty, and the weight of my actions felt unbearable. The next day I tried to apologize, but Lisa wouldn't even acknowledge me. That rejection was a punch to the gut, but I knew I deserved it. I spent the day feeling isolated and ashamed, barely able to focus. At lunch, I retrieved my meal and returned to my desk, hoping to avoid further interactions. But when I started eating, I immediately noticed something was wrong. My food had an unusual crunch, and upon closer inspection, I saw what it was: peanuts. This discovery terrified me. I have a severe peanut allergy, and exposure could be fatal without immediate treatment. My throat began to close, and panic set in as I realized my epinephrine injector wasn't in my desk drawer. I barely managed to stagger into my boss's office to ask for help. Thankfully, the office kept an emergency kit, and he found an epinephrine injector just in time. After administering it, I was rushed to the hospital, where I spent hours being monitored and treated. After I recovered, it became clear that someone had tampered with my food. Although no one admitted to it, and the police investigation went nowhere, my gut instinct told me it was Lisa. She had been cold and indifferent throughout the entire ordeal, which only fueled my suspicions. A couple of weeks later, I was let go from the company. They cited my long history of poor behavior as the reason, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. I started over at a new job, and this time, I vowed to be different. The experience had taught me a painful but necessary lesson. Everyone deserves kindness and respect, no matter what personal struggles I might be facing. To this day, I regret the person I was and the way I treated others. I've worked hard to become a better colleague and human being, and while I can't undo the past, I can ensure that my future is shaped by empathy and understanding. If there's one takeaway from this experience, it's this: be careful how you treat people. You never know what someone might be capable of when pushed too far. An ordinary life disrupted. I'm a 42-year-old woman who has always been content with a simple, routine life. My work as a secretary receptionist at an accounting office was uneventful but suited me just fine. Things changed when Gary joined our office. At first, he seemed like a nice, unassuming man. Feeling sorry for his apparent loneliness, I tried to befriend him, a decision I would come to deeply regret. Gary was, to put it kindly, boring. Conversations with him revolved almost exclusively around his cats, their toys, and their habits. Despite my lack of interest, I continued to humor him, thinking I was his only friend, and not wanting to hurt his feelings. After about 6 months, however, Gary began to exhibit concerning behavior. He grew clingy, texting me constantly on my days off and insisting we meet for lunch or drinks. If I declined, he would get upset, calling it our tradition. He also grew visibly irritated whenever I mentioned my husband. Once, when I told him I couldn't meet because I had plans with my husband, he actually suggested I cancel to spend time with him instead. The tipping point came when Gary overheard a coworker excitedly discussing a barbecue my husband and I were hosting. I had purposely avoided mentioning it to him, but once he found out, he confronted me angrily, demanding to know why he wasn't invited. To avoid a scene, I reluctantly extended an invitation. When Gary arrived at the barbecue, he immediately drew attention, and not in a good way. He was wearing a Hawaiian shirt and a Speedo, which left everyone shocked and uncomfortable. Things took a darker turn when he began staring at my 16-year-old daughter, who was sunbathing by the pool. Approaching him to steer his attention elsewhere, I was horrified when he pointed at her and said, "Who is she? Oh my God, the things I'd do to that girl." I was speechless and furious. I told my husband what Gary had said, and he promptly confronted him. Gary stormed out of our backyard, yelling obscenities. Though I didn't hear their exchange, I knew I wanted nothing more to do with him. For weeks after the barbecue, Gary continued to act strangely at work. He would glare at me, watch me as I walked to my car, and send multiple texts apologizing and asking to rekindle our friendship. I ignored him completely, hoping he would eventually leave me alone. Around this time, my daughter began complaining that she felt someone was watching her through her bedroom window. She kept her curtains closed at all times, but despite our assurances of safety, she remained uneasy. The situation escalated one afternoon when my husband, running late to pick up our daughter from soccer practice, arrived just in time to see her about to get into a strange car. The driver sped off when my husband yelled, leaving my daughter shaken. She explained that the man had identified himself as Gary, claiming I had asked him to pick her up. Horrified, we called the police. They located Gary and arrested him. The search of his car revealed duct tape, rope, zip ties, and over 100 photographs of my daughter taken at her school and through her bedroom window. He had been stalking her for weeks, meticulously planning the kidnapping. Gary was charged with attempted kidnapping and sentenced to 2 years in prison, along with a no-contact order. 2 years passed quickly, and Gary was released. We moved to a new house and enrolled my daughter in a different school, taking every precaution to ensure our safety. Thankfully, we haven't seen him since, but the trauma of that time lingers. I often think about how differently things could have ended if my husband hadn't arrived when he did. The party nightmare. During college, I worked at a sandwich chain where a coworker invited me to a casual party at his place. The event seemed innocent. There was food, drinks, and pool volleyball. I only planned to stay for a few hours before heading to another party with my girlfriend. At first, everything seemed fine. But after having just 3 light beers, I started feeling inexplicably out of control. My memory blurred, and I became uncharacteristically aggressive and emotional, even falling down a flight of stairs and injuring myself. I later woke up in the middle of the night, confused and bloody, surrounded by police. The next day, texts from the coworker flooded my phone, making inappropriate comments and requests. It became clear he had slipped something into my drink. Though I reported the incident to my manager to avoid shifts with him, I never took further action, something I still regret. Creepy coworker at the mall. A year after graduating high school, I worked at a sunglasses retailer in an outdoor mall. The job required a business casual dress code, which meant I often wore skirts or dresses. One summer evening, we were short-staffed, and a rep from another store, who I'll call Joe, came to help. At first, everything seemed normal. Joe and I even had a mutual friend. which put me at ease. As the evening progressed, we closed the store and began our nightly tasks. I was busy at the register, my back to the stockroom where Joe was. Suddenly, I felt what I thought was a fly brushing my thigh. Annoyed, I brushed it off and continued working. Moments later, I felt a prick in the same spot. Turning around, I was horrified to find Joe crouched behind me, trying to look up my skirt. His finger was barely touching my upper thigh. Joe jumped up, and I instinctively walked away, trying to stay calm. It was late, the mall was mostly deserted, and I was terrified of what might happen next. I quickly finished my tasks, grabbed my belongings, and told Joe we were done for the night. As we walked to the parking lot, he repeatedly asked if I needed a ride to my car. I declined each time, but he persisted, saying, "Let me take you to your car." I bolted to my car, locked the doors, and drove off. The next day, I reported the incident to my manager in HR. They were sympathetic but claimed there was no proof and promised only that I wouldn't be scheduled with Joe again. Frustrated, I took matters into my own hands and looked up his name in the county court records. To my shock, I found past charges for sexual assault. I informed my manager, and Joe was fired. While I was relieved, the experience left a lasting impact. I can't imagine what might have happened if I hadn't caught him in the act.